Hi everyone. So I'm recording this in my bedroom, and like I said, I'm trying to avoid little munchkins, my little children running in and disrupting the lecture. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, we might have a little 2-year-old come and pounce on me in a little bit here, but let's try our best here to get through the material. It's appropriate human development, and we're going to start this whole thing off by talking about little kids and children. So we call human development affectionately, we call it womb to tomb, and it's basically looking at the entire process from conception through aging and death and dying. And so there's a lot of different things that are consistent across human lifetimes, and there's some things that are very unique to each human's lifetime. And so we can look at all those through the lens of human development. This is one of my passion areas. One of the classes I teach, in addition to general psychology, is human development. So let's go here. Okay, so exploring human development. Development, if we define that, it's a pattern of continuity and change in human capabilities. Not everybody goes on the exact same developmental journey. However, many things rhyme, and many things seem to be quite similar for people. For example, the ability to walk. We all basically learn how to walk within 6 to 9 months of one another. In terms of probably that median kid walks around 12 months. Some children walk as early as 9 months. Some children walk later at more like 15, 16 months. But in general, the sort of the peak of the curve for most people is about 12 months. So that's a pattern of continuity and change in human capabilities, and we can apply that to language acquisition. We can apply that to adolescence, through career fulfillment, lots of different things that we can look at sort of in the aggregate of us as a human species and sort of how we experience life. And the thing within development that really becomes very important is this next point, which is the nature versus nurture discussion. So if we know that some things are very humanistic, right? Some things that are just like part of our evolutionary process, well, then we can look strongly to the nature element of that. So something that is in our DNA, something that's part of our species, it's a biological inheritance of some kind within your genes. And then, of course, we start looking at genetic expression, epigenetics, and things like that when it comes to your nurture. So, how is your environment and your social experience shaping that experience? And so, that's an exciting thing to look at because we can start looking at what are the pros and cons of treating people in particular ways and having different social policies. And so, there's a lot to be learned from the nurture side of it, in addition to understanding DNA and sort of us as biological individuals. So let's start with physical development. Obviously, as humans, what makes us unique to any other animal species is the size, the mass of our brain, and the way that our brain is structured. And within infancy, our brain it comes out. We come out of our moms like relatively unformed in terms of our brain. The genetic roadmap on the nature side of things is very well laid out. However, the actual brain itself is quite underdeveloped. And that's basically because we need to be born because we're an upright species where our ancestors, stood up, which allowed us a lot of things. It allowed us to see our predators better, it allowed us to be more locomotive over long stretches of territory, or that's sort of our nomadic roots. We only have two limbs to feed oxygen to versus quadrupeds, which have to feed oxygen to four legs. It allowed us to really expand our territory as nomads and sort of hunters and gatherers. Well, in doing so, when we sort of stood up as a species, our pelvises became very tight to be very efficient with that locomotion with two legs, and so therefore, as our brains grew and our pelvises shrank, our childbirth became earlier and earlier and earlier in the developmental process. So we have some of the most underdeveloped offspring compared relative to, even though our gestational period is quite long, our our offspring are really relatively underdeveloped when they are born. And so because of that, we can't walk, we can't talk, we can do very little things, and we have to have our parents basically care for us or somebody care for us, otherwise we'll die. Whereas if you see a cow being born in the field, which my children love it when we see a cow giving birth. They always want to stop the car and watch. It's kind of funny. But those cows can walk within minutes of being born. And think about us. It takes us a year to be able to walk. And so why is that the case? Well, again, we had to be born so early so that our heads would fit through the pelvic region in the birth canal, that our brains are really relatively unformed, and so we can only, for example, see 6 to 12 inches uh, away from our face so early. Basically, just enough to get sustenance, just enough to get food. We have lots of reflexes, lots of crying, lots of sucking capability and stuff like that, just to get nourishment. Well, in that infancy, the 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 critical phase of development is in that dendritic spreading. So we literally see that brain just like grow like wildfire in those first few years of life, and it's really front loaded. So those first few moments of life are very, very important, and then the next month and then the next two, because that's when things become myelinated. So even though people employ tactics like cry it out, where they basically just leave babies in the room and they cry and cry and cry until they self-soothe with no attention from their parents, because it's either been taught to them or their parents think that that's the best way to go, that we know that that starts to affect the brain. It starts to affect connection and things along those lines. And so myelination is that ability, again, for that myelin sheath to grow around that neuron and become more and more efficient in its process. So the dendritic spreading is those dendrites growing throughout the brain, and the myelin coming in and expediting those orders. So what are those orders? What are those neurons? What is that brain? It depends on the environment. So that's when you start seeing nature interact with nurture. And this is basically the density that we're talking about here visually. At birth, it's not very dense. The brain volume is quite small, but then by 2 years old, the brain volume is about 60 to 80% of the adult brain matter. So we've seen a significant amount of dendritic spreading and myelination occur in those first 2 years. So again, what is the foundation of that human being? It comes back to those first couple of years. Now, Erickson, who's a developmental theorist, Piaget, and a lot of different theorists look to this sort of early phase of development in terms of other things coming online later. So, for example, if we look at, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, attachment styles, depending on how that child was attached to their primary caregiver, that could dictate potentially relationship types, archetypes, issues, even well into their 40s and 50s and beyond, depending on those first couple of years. That's at least the theory of attachment theory. So it all has to do with how this brain is initially myelinated, initially grown, in addition to vision and auditory information and all the other things that we need to worry about, and locomotion, kinesthetic learning. So in childhood, we start looking at more of that preschool to the grades, right? So we're talking about more kindergarten through middle school years. That's considered childhood before we get to adolescence. There's more myelination. Obviously, this is when some of the most myelin is developed. It's a long period of time. It lasts from about 2 years old to about 13 years old. So you can see it's about 10 years. Lots of myelination has occurred. And then we discuss something called pruning. Now, pruning is an interesting concept because what happens is there's a genetic propensity or an early stimulation in some arena, and then what happens is that that is either fortified or not via pruning. So, for example, one's ability to be artistic or creative, for example. We see that most children in the kindergarten environment are very, very artistic. They love to move, they love to paint, they love to draw, they love to be creative, right? And so some children, usually the children who are identified as being sort of like highly skilled in that arena, have those skills fortified by their environment. So, for example, the teacher will give them feedback, you're really good at this. Maybe your painting wins sort of an art show, wins gets nominated for an art show at the school, whatever it is. And you start getting feedback, okay, like the environment starts telling you you're good at this. And then in the inverse, it could start telling you that you're not very good at this. And so all of a sudden you start seeing people that have a propensity or a direction towards a task, whether that be art, singing, uh, physical movement, making friends, and you start getting this feedback from the environment that you're good at something, and so then parents tend to sort of lean into that, and educators tend to lean into that, and then what gets left on sort of the editing room floor is things that you didn't, sort of have a lot of exposure to, things that you weren't sort of given a lot of reinforcement within. And so it's like if you never got feedback that you're a good artist because maybe you're not very good at that point in your life because maybe you're younger than everybody in your class. Because if you think about the typical kindergarten class, you have some children that are just turned 5 and some children that are about to turn 6. And that's a large developmental difference of 1 year at that age. Less so when you start getting into middle school and high school, that 1 year feels less significant in your life. But a child that's 5 versus a child that's almost 6, that's a significantly different developmental situation. And so a child might feel that they are not good at something when they're perfectly in alignment with their development, but they're put into this category as a kindergartner. And so maybe their fine motor skills aren't the same as other children. Maybe their gross motor skills aren't the same as some children. And so they start getting feedback that they're not necessarily good at something. So then later, when there's opportunity to go into specialization, maybe they already have a fixed mindset in that arena, and they no longer want to explore that arena. And so those things over the course of a childhood are slowly pruned away. And so there are certain things that are prioritized in childhood and certain things that are neglected in childhood. And again, that depends on the environment. For example, people who allow their children to play excessive amounts of video games or have excessive amount of screen time, those children get really, really good and get really, really myelinated at those abilities. They get really, really good. I mean, if you see some of the best video gamers in the world, they've been playing since they were children, and the way that they can handle that controller is remarkable. Now, you have to decide for yourself, is that something that is a priority? Another good example is television. I watched a lot of television as a young child. I watched a lot of television as a grade school child, and now I'm very, very good at watching television. And it sounds funny, but it's true. I'm very good at remembering scripts and storylines and just knowing what happened in every situation and trivia and things like that. But to me, at this point in my life, I don't want to be good at that. I wish I had been better at whatever it is, riding my bike or drawing or socializing or anything along those lines. So it's an interesting discussion to look at what are your children doing, what were you doing during that period of time, and what sort of skills were myelinated, and are we talking about maybe different languages, things along those lines that we have to prioritize within that nurture bucket of pruning and myelination. Of course, we start to see the rapid growth of frontal lobes in this time. This allows our working memory to get even stronger, which if you remember from the from the memory chapter, children from 6 to 7 to 8 years old, their working memory just explodes and blossoms, and they all of a sudden can keep track of different variables and different things. And little 2-year-olds and little 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, they just don't have the ability to maintain the short-term memory. It's just not developed yet, so we can't have the same expectations as those children. So their memories aren't as strong because they don't have as many mnemonic devices. So language development. So if children are struggling with language development anyway, they're going to have less ways to define their memories and therefore have less capabilities of bringing back those memories and consolidating those memories in the future, reconsolidating them in the future. So, for example, girls tend to have a little bit better and more pronounced language development than boys do. Again, because of this frontal lobe development. Girls' frontal lobes come online a little bit faster than boys in general. So their decision making tends to be a little bit better, a little bit less risk taking, things along those lines. And that tends to be on the sex side of development as opposed to the gender side of development. That's just something that is sort of innate within the genome of an XY, XX chromosome individual. Now, poor nutrition and poor levels of stimulation can stunt growth. Again, omega-3 fatty acids are very valuable for myelin. Inflammation and poor grade fats and proteins are obviously very detrimental to the developing brain. And so these types of things can show up in both, the individual's mass and size and growth, which is important in developmental science, but also in their brain and their emotional states as well. This is a typical physical development pattern that we can see. Again, we're going to see very not significant differences, but we're going to see differences. So children raise their head, 2 months, roll over, like 3 months, basically pull themselves up early on, pull themselves up and start practicing walking around 9, 10 months, creeping and crawling, and then all of a sudden around that sort of 12-month point they can walk. But some children, they go all the way to 16 months for walking, and some children are walking at 9 months. So it just depends on, what the situation is. Um, but they don't need to be taught this. They're going to walk. Now, some children walk earlier in societies where it behooves them to be able to walk. So in nomadic tribes in Africa, for example, children are basically incentivized to walk earlier. So the parents do things like hold onto their fingers and help them walk for themselves, and maybe just hold on to one finger and allow them to sort of walk earlier. So their children tend to walk earlier because they're nomadic. And so the sooner a child can walk for themselves, the less the parent has to carry that child. And that's significant. Now, in the opposite, in Bolivia, in one of these more mountainous regions, we see the average child walking around 16 months. And the reason for that is because, well, they live in very altitude and very precarious, mountainous regions. And so if a baby starts wandering off with an underdeveloped frontal lobe, they can't make very good decisions. And so they oftentimes walk off cliffs. And so what the parents do instead is the child starts to walk away. They actually grab the child and bring them close to stunt their walking, because they don't want them walking until their brains are developed enough to navigate some of those precarious environments. So depending on how you dictate the situation, you can either expedite or delay something like walking. Now, is that going to affect the child long term, that they walk too early or walk too late? It's hard to say. It doesn't seem to show much impact. But in general, the rule of thumb is they're going to walk when they're going to walk, and you can do whatever you need to do to help scaffold that. But trying to get the child to walk early, what benefit does that really have? Well, they're more risk prone, so that's something that you need to think about. Okay, so physical development in adolescence now we're talking about. So now we're talking about sort of that puberty period through really the start of early adulthood, which in our country it's been significantly delayed because of the elongation of the sort of academic experience and the elongation of staying at home with parents. And so adolescence has lasted longer now than it ever has. An example of that would be my parents were married and homeowners at 18 years old in Santa Cruz, like in a relatively expensive market. That just seems so foreign to us now. Married and homeowners at 18? Push that back 10 years now, right? Married and homeowners, 28? That still sounds young, especially the latter part of that equation, the homeowner part. Now, if you go to other parts of the country where you start to see lower cost of living, in Nebraska, for example, where I went to college, sure, 28 years old, prime time to be buying your first home. I was married at 27, but married and homeowners in the Bay Area at 28. Now think about that. Why is that important? Well, married, right? Homeowner, that means you have a lot of responsibility. That means you need to be well into that adulthood period. So you need to be paying your own mortgage, having a full-time job, responsibilities to a partner, putting dinner on the table, all these types of things that married couples and professionals do. That's been delayed. 18, it just seems so foreign. We're still in high school. I mean, my parents got married in the summer after high school. And so, and they're still married, and they had 2 children, and, doing well and all that kind of stuff, knock on wood. But anyway, the point is we're still in college until about 22. A lot of us are living at home until about 25. And so thinking about adolescence in a new light is important. But anyway, adolescent brain is going through a lot of changes. Its mass is basically stable since childhood. But what's changing are things like the amygdala. The amygdala is coming online very, very strongly and powerfully. And that's where that sort of emotion and fear center of the brain. And so we're sort of drawn towards our emotions at this stage. Emotions become very important. How people are treating me, how I'm feeling about myself, it's just overwhelming for many people. I remember it going through that time. Thinking about people talking about you, thinking about being accepted, thinking about the way that you look, the way that you fit in, what's your identity, what's your gender, what's your ethnicity, what's your culture, what are you good at? There's so many variables to consider in this time, and it really comes down to that emotional component. And the problem with this is that, and I'm saying it's a problem. Maybe it's not a problem, but the issue is that the amygdala comes online well before the prefrontal cortex. When you can really have this higher order reasoning and decision making that can sort of override some of that emotion. Um, so people are doing things in adolescence that they probably would not do in their early adulthood, or especially in their middle adulthood. They look back at some of the things that they've done. Many people in this class who are in their middle adulthood, which is somewhere between 30 and let's say 60, 55 or so. They are in that period where they look back at their adolescence and they say, "What was I doing? What was I thinking?" Well, the problem is that we weren't really thinking. We were really reacting towards our emotions. Now, again, sex-wise, girls see a stronger prefrontal cortex development than boys, and so this is one of the reasons why girls, adolescent females, tend to prefer older males, because their peers are just not at the same level of the prefrontal cortex development. It takes usually a year or two delay for a boy to catch up with a girl in that regard. So it kind of makes sense. It's like, you find yourself very frustrated with people of the opposite sex, for example, whether that be friendships or romantic inclinations. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that things like delayed gratification, poor decision making, all relate to this delay of the prefrontal cortex behind the amygdala, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And then melatonin is released differently in this adolescent brain. It's released about an hour or two delayed for some reason. And so we see our adolescents getting fatigued and tired and ready for bed usually an hour or two later than they used to as children, and an hour or two later than their parents, because it's only really specific to adolescence. It has something to do with the hormone levels. And so it throws it off for somehow. So we see people that, are expected to still go to bed at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and or even 9, right? Which children are. Children are expected to be in bed by 7, 8, 9 o'clock latest. Whereas adolescents are expected maybe 10 o'clock. Well, it's very hard to fall asleep because your melatonin hasn't been secreted yet. So you tend to fall asleep midnight, 1 a.m. If you have digital stimulation, even later, video games, videos, this sort of blue light from the screen. And so now all of a sudden we're pushing back bedtime to 2, 3 a.m., even later sometimes, especially video games, because that's stimulating and it's blue light. It's really bad for your sleep cycle. And then all of a sudden you're being expected to wake up at still 7 a.m., 8 a.m., whatever it is, or even earlier. And so what ends up happening is sleep just gets compromised. And so when sleep gets compromised, then health gets compromised, emotional health gets compromised, everything gets compromised. And so we start to see people ask me all the time, why are we having, this mental health crisis? It's like, well, all you got to do is you got to look at our food, you got to look at our sleep, and you got to look at what we're being exposed to in the media. And if you have those three things and you understand those three things, then you start to understand real clearly why mood disorders are so prevalent these days. If we're not getting enough nutrition and sleep to restore, and then we're being bombarded with images and different things to prioritize and give us anxiety, this is where we're left. And so it's a tough place to be as a society right now. Although there's lots of great information to help you figure this out, it's just a gauntlet to try to figure out on your own. And this is just a graphic kind of showing you your typical kind of middle school, high school age child or adolescent sort of being preoccupied with that social, emotional perspective on things, because that amygdala is really highlighted in this period of time, whereas that prefrontal cortex just needs some time to really get enough experience to figure out decision making and delayed gratification. Now, Piaget, he's a developmental psychologist, and he talks a lot about how children view the world and how children perceive the world. And in adolescence, he has this sort of like final phase of development, which is the formal operational phase of development. Okay. Now you can look at the other phases; they're also important, but the adolescent one is very important for adolescent discussion because right around that middle school to high school era, you start seeing children and that become adolescents um, thinking in this more formal operational phase of development. So they're very good at following models. They're very good at following, for example, mathematical equations, economic, remembering historical events and things along those lines. But what they need to understand more, and they start to exercise that prefrontal cortex more, is in their sort of operational processing. So critical thinking is what I'm being specific to. This is a good time to start introducing critical thinking experiments and concepts to a child. What ends up happening is they're really susceptible to idealism and indoctrination. So they become very susceptible to people with very specific ideologies that sound very, very convincing. So maybe they're political ideals or economic ideals. Whatever it is, they become soldiers for that information, for that dogma, for that concept. And so we know that political parties that go directly for the youth because they know that if they can convince them that this is something that behooves them, that benefits them, that they will vote for that, they will march through the streets and tell people their cause. And it's not until later in life, around 30 and 40 years old in middle adulthood, that people have the experience level at that point to really question that dogma and really question those ideals. They're still figuring it out. So my recommendation to any adolescent in the class is, while it's appealing to get very excited and dogmatic about a particular ideology on something, it's also beneficial to you to sort of maintain your free agent status that you sort of want to hear both sides of the discussion so you can start to further develop your critical thinking capacity and faculty because that's going to benefit you in the long run. What you don't want to do is just subscribe to one ideology too early on and then neglect the other side of the argument or the discussion and then never fulfill the full, breadth of that particular concept. And so these days it's much more challenging, even though there's more information out there than ever before on different concepts. It's also very appealing to you to subscribe to one ideology and then follow all of those people on social media, and then they just continue to indoctrinate and deliver that same information. And those idealistic adolescents just drink it up because it just fits right in line with what they believe, and they're never challenged on the opposite perspective. So that's why in my classes, what I try to do is deliver multiple sides of an argument so that people can further expand their critical thinking faculties so that they can better make informed decisions for themselves instead of just indoctrinating like so many other resources do or attempt to do in our society. So in adulthood, we start thinking again now, I've already sort of talked about this, more reflectively. We start thinking back at our history. Okay, that worked then, that didn't work then. And you start putting things into a hopper. So many adults are, for example, independent when it comes to political ideals. They don't register with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or even Libertarian Party or Green Party. They just basically say, you know what, I'm an independent. And every election, I'm going to see who comes to the table with what ideas, and I'll make a decision from there because they're thinking reflectively. They're thinking of their past and all their lessons that they've learned throughout their lifetime. Very, very indicative of being an adult. You also become more skeptical. The early ideology that you used to subscribe to, you start questioning, go, wait a minute, is that right? Have I missed a big chunk of the picture? More realistic. People start understanding, okay, I can't always have my cake and eat it too. I have to make tough decisions. If I want this service, I'm going to have to pay this tax. Is that service worth it to me? Now that I'm making money, I can't just subscribe to one ideology. I now have to understand how these tax rates affect me and how these services affect me. So for example, if a local fire department is in the case where they don't have enough money to purchase a new piece of equipment or trucks? Are you willing to pass a parcel tax that's going to cost you an extra $1,000 a year so that your fire department has the resources that they need? Well, an adult will say, hold on a second, define to me what exactly it is that you're going to purchase, why you can't purchase that thing now, because $1,000 is a lot of money. And so it's less likely for an adult to just say, yes, support our fire department, and more likely to say, hold on, let me look at the actual specifics of that and see what actually it's going to do to my situation, and then I'll make a decision if that's a good decision for me or not. And then it's up to the fire department to be transparent, to tell you exactly where the money is being spent and why this equipment is going to help keep you safe, for example. Um, and recognizing that thinking is influenced by emotion. The older you get, the more you know you have to take a time out for a second and really think through. Don't send that email, right? So instead of just firing back that text or getting on Twitter or whatever it is and just being emotional in your response, the more developed your prefrontal cortex is and the more experience you have, the more you say, maybe I'll have my significant other read through this text first, or read through this email I'm about to send first, or maybe I'll sleep on it for the night and then reopen it and take a look at it in the morning. You start to understand that emotions are amazing, but they're also dangerous, or they can be dangerous. They can be dangerous. Emotions can be the most beautiful thing of all time, but they also can be very dangerous if you don't understand what you're looking at. And so the more experience you get, the more likely you're going to understand that and sort of put that into the calculus when you're making a decision. Now, in middle adulthood, which is where I am, again, 30 to sort of 50s, you start looking at this crystallized intelligence, which is really cool because it's your accumulated information and verbal skills. You can add a new word every week, a new word every day if you wanted to. You get more and more experience in understanding how situations work, and this can be both good and be bad. So I'm trying to give you both sides of the aisle. It's great because the more times you teach general psychology, for example, the more information you have to give, the more examples you have to give, the easier it is because you've said it so many times. It's deeply myelinated. However, it can also become a thorn in your side or an issue for you if it is causing you to sort of not change and adapt to a new environment. So, for example, there are a lot of people within the business world that have learned certain skills, and those skills are crystallized, and they're very good at those skills. But now all of a sudden, they have new hurdles to understand. Social media is a prime example of that. Can somebody who's been in marketing for in their 50s, right? So they've been in marketing for, let's say, 25 years. Can they adapt to a new strategy where they're no longer looking at television and radio advertisement and they're looking at social media advertising? Can they adapt? Well, just like anything else, it's a new skill and it takes time to learn it. And so if you're going to be giving up something you put years and years and years of research into, and that was your advantage, and now it's gone, that's tough. And so we see firefighters, for example, they spend years and years and years fighting certain types of fires, and then all of a sudden there's a new structure, a new type of structure that's being introduced to them, a new building technology, and then all of a sudden they make a decision based on previous information, and now it's the wrong decision. So crystallized intelligence can be a very, very beneficial thing, but it also can be detrimental depending on how you look at it. But it's great because you can start looking at it and going, okay, now if I'm 18, I'm 20, what do I want to crystallize over the next 20 years? What's something I want to crystallize? Maybe a language, right? Maybe a foreign language, for example. If it's a computer language, that's tough because we know that's probably going to change. A video game example, that's probably going to change. So whatever you're sort of developing your skill set in, the more timeless those things are, potentially the better they are for you, okay? And that fluid intelligence, unfortunately, as we get into middle adulthood, that starts to come down. The ability to sort of have that fluid IQ starts to dissipate and go down. Even with the most intelligent people on earth, they start to see a fluid intelligence drop, but a crystallized intelligence rise, which again can feel like a net gain because you're putting more and more information into the hopper, but your ability to figure out things on the fly tends to go down. And in late adulthood, now we're starting to talk about in those senior years, right? the numbers of dimensions of intelligence start to decline. I'm going to show you a graph in a second that'll really open your eyes to some things. And some are maintained and may even increase, like crystallized intelligence, which is a type of wisdom. Wisdom is a type of crystallized intelligence. But if you look at this graph, you can start to see, wow, this is really quite interesting. So if we go to verbal ability, we look at this dark purple line, you can see that one's purple line here, one's verbal ability, is one of the last things to maintain because of so much experience and usage. We have to stay verbally engaged throughout our lifetime until we can't be verbally engaged anymore. But you can see that it hangs on much longer than numeric ability in yellow and all these other abilities, inductive reasoning, verbal memory. It all starts to fall off the table before verbal ability does. So we start to see people in their 60s and 70s, they can't recall somebody's name, they can't recall a date of something that occurred, they can't recall a concept, but they can still articulate their frustration, they can still ask you about your day. And so it's amazing to watch people like Warren Buffett in his late 80s, early 90s, still verbally engaged, but still very capable of telling you all about what's going on in the stock market on any given day. And that's, again, because for 5 hours a day, he's looking at financial spreadsheets. He's talking to people in conference calls. He's trying to understand this market. He's trying to maintain those abilities, because if you don't use it, you lose it. That's pruning, right? And so if somebody is only relying on their verbal ability, that will probably maintain. But if they're not doing basic mathematical equations, for example, like, some number, right? 135 divided by 14, and they don't just once in a while go in there and try to actually keep those numeric abilities on topped off, those things will decline over time. Now, whether or not that's important, that's questionable, right? But we're talking about neural health and sort of like understanding how this brain eventually over time loses its myelin and loses its capabilities via pruning. So it's very important to stay topped off, but verbal ability will be there much longer than most. Now, when you're talking about this nurture element, we're talking about socio-emotional process, right? So we're talking about development of the individual within a social context. It involves changes to the individual in the social relationship, emotional life, and personal qualities. Do they have a significant other? Do they have children? Do they have their best friends? Are they good in being acknowledged for their and for their job at work, for example? These are all related to you as a socio-emotional individual, right? Do people love you? Do people want time with you? Do they want are you rejected by society? Are you isolated? Are you on your own? Like, all these things start to affect the mental health of an individual. Well, it all starts in infancy. And we start looking at this process early on in life when we first look at the individual's temperament, their individualized temperament. So you all were born with this temperament, right? This behavioral style that either was classified as an easy child, a difficult child, or a slow to warm child. These are the three classifications, although I personally believe there's a lot of crossover. But in general, a child is either real simple, easy to understand, they let their needs be known, but they're generally a very happy baby. They smile, they give you a lot of feedback, and that starts to dictate how the society is going to treat them. If a child, you walk in the room and the baby looks at you and gives you a big smile, you're going to smile back, and that child's going to start trusting the world more and more. But if you're a difficult child and a stranger walks in the room and you instantly grimace and you instantly start crying, well, then the stranger's going to look away because they feel like, oh, I made the baby sad. I'm so sorry. And the child starts to understand, oh, okay, like the world is something that doesn't want to interact with me. And the slow to warm up child depends on how the individual interacted with them. If they try to interact with them and they're all of a sudden, shy, they kind of disengage, or if the person understands developmental psychology, they say, okay, this child but maybe just needs a minute. And then over time, I'll kind of sidle up next to them and show them something I'm working on. And then the baby might warm up. The toddler might warm up. Both of my children are slow to warm up children. And so once they know you, once they know the situation, I kind of envision them similar to like a house cat. Like a house cat you put a house cat in a brand new environment, they're going to look around, they're going to find somewhere safe to hunker down before they get the full lay of the land. And an easy child is like a Labrador Retriever. They walk in, their tail's wagging, they're just happy to see everybody. And a difficult child is very hard to work with because they cry more. Their temperament is um, uh, more haphazard. It's hard to figure them out. But when you start to understand that this is going to dictate their environment, then you as a parent, you as a caregiver, you as a teacher know what you can do to control that situation, that environment to the best of their capabilities. And you know the easy child is going to get a good environment, generally speaking. And the difficult child might get not so great an environment. So maybe you try to compensate for that. And then the slower warm-up child, maybe you need to take time and be patient and more flexible with. But this all comes down to the attachment. So how is this child attached in these close emotional bonds between that infant and their caregivers? That's all attachment. So when we look at attachment styles, we look at the Bowlby's strange situation test, where they basically took a child, they put them in a room, and they put the primary caregiver, so usually the mom, but sometimes sometimes the father, and sometimes a nanny or a grandparent. But generally speaking, they put the mom in the room with the child, and the child's playing with some toys, and then they basically ask the mother to get up and leave the room, or the caregiver to get up and leave the room. So this is an unknown environment. This is usually at a laboratory setting at a university. So the child is already a little bit on edge because they're not sure where they are. It's not at home. And the primary caregiver gets up and leaves the room. Okay. Now, the securely attached child, okay, it's just the first type of child, they're going to not be happy that mom or the caregiver left. They're going to cry. They're going to look around. Where's mom? What's going on? So they're going to be distressed. Okay. The avoidant child, right, that's had this sort of like conflicted relationship with their parents and their caregivers, maybe because of their temperament, maybe because of the caregiver, or a combination thereof. They are just not going to care at all that the parent got up and left, the caregiver got up and left. Because guess what? They already are self-sufficient. They don't really have a strong emotional attachment to that parent already. So maybe this is a parent that leans too heavily on cry it out technique, where they just let their kid cry and cry and cry and cry until the kid probably finally just gave up and sort of that broke their will. And so now they're that avoidant temperament or attachment style. Or last but not least, the most challenging, which is the anxious ambivalent. So they cry and cry and cry and cry and cry, much more so than the secure child. Their emotions are unregulated. They have a very difficult time in regulating their emotions. Whereas the secure child is crying, they know something's wrong, but they're kind of keeping it together. And the avoidant child just doesn't care at all. And then that leads to the parent coming back into the room, and we see in the secure case, the secure attachment style, the parent instantly is able to calm the child down. I've got mom, I've got dad, my home base is back, I'm secure, I'm safe, I'm good. And so that's what we want to see in about 60% of cases. Secure attachment style is the case. So most of us have a secure attachment style, which is really good because that allows us to maintain that style within all our relationships. When somebody goes out into the world, as long as we trust that they're going to come back, there's lower levels of jealousy, lower levels of distrust, lower levels of anxiety. But it's in the avoidant relationship where the mom comes back and the baby couldn't care less that the mom is back. Very hard for that individual throughout their lifetime to forge really genuine connected relationships because it's just not their thing, not something that they really prioritize, or not something that's innately a part of them as a human being anymore or from the very beginning. And then the last one is that anxious ambivalent personality type or attachment style type, where they cried like crazy when mom left and they cry like crazy when mom or dad come back. They just don't have that emotional regulation capability and they don't know who to trust. It's very hard for them to understand how this works. So we see anxious ambivalent much more in parents that are less present, and maybe things like nannies or babysitters are involved in their lives. They're not sure who to put their attachment to. Sometimes the parent is reliable, sometimes the parent is not, and so that child is oftentimes confused, and so they don't really know how to organize their attachment. So you can imagine that in their 20s and 30s, the secure attachment style individuals are very popular because people trust them and they give trust back. The avoidant personality type oftentimes aren't in relationships or they're in very different types of relationships. And then anxious ambivalent, they it's very challenging for them because it's hard for them to trust, it's hard for them to feel connected, but they desperately need it. It's very different than the avoidant. And so secure attachment style people with secure attachment style people, usually easy. Secure attachment style people with anxious ambivalent can be very good for the anxious ambivalent person because they have somebody who they can really trust. But then the secure person, they can oftentimes get lots of feedback about distrust and they don't understand it. And they're like, why don't you trust me? I haven't done anything. So it can be very conflicting within a relationship. So here's all the information I was telling you about. The strange situation test is what I just described. 65% of children are secure, 20-25% avoidant, and 10 to 15% anxious ambivalent. And this, of course, affects them in their social relationships throughout primary school and their relationships within adulthood. Okay. Now, parents are bonded towards their children, fortunately, most times through a strong release of oxytocin, both at birth for the mother and for the father, and in those early interactions with the child that forges that relationship with that child, that bonding neurotransmitter that wants us to hug, wants us to connect, wants us to touch. Okay, so my child, for example, when they're eating lunch at the table, I'm working and I'm going to get something from my office or whatever, and I walk by, I just touch the back of their back, I touch the back of their heads, and it's just this oxytocin release on both sides of the equation. I'm here. I'm connected with you. Again, going back to that attachment style. Now, higher levels of oxytocin are related to that higher maternal attachment. And of course, the problem is that if like, remember when we were talking about drugs, if there's any artificial abuse of these neurotransmitters, it can affect the natural occurrence of these neurotransmitters. And Pitocin is the drug that is used in labor induction in the case of C-sections, and it basically, well, Pitocin is used for labor induction. It's basically a synthetic form of oxytocin trying to stimulate labor. Okay, what happens is that once that is ingested or taken at a high level, is it starts to affect the natural occurrence of oxytocin. So we see that for labor induction and for C-sections, where the baby is actually removed via the abdominal wall via surgery, where they cut through the abdomen, actual abdominal tissue to remove the baby, is that natural occurring oxytocin levels are much lower. So therefore, we see higher rates of postpartum depression in individuals who had those C-sections because of the element of surgery and the element of the lack of oxytocin and the implementation of Pitocin. Unfortunately, in our country, we've seen a dramatic increase in C-sections from 10 to 15% in the 1960s into about 1/3 of labors and deliveries now. And the death rate has stayed flat. So the mortality rate has stayed flat. So those C-sections have done very little to benefit mother and child in terms of mortality rates. What they have done, however, is significantly affected postpartum experiences for both mother and child and father. And all the caregivers involved. So it's something that definitely needs to be talked about and looked at, and we look at that very deeply in the human development classes that I teach and child psych classes that I teach. This is just a very benign and safe image to put in a class. I could have gone much more graphic in this, but this gives you a good concept of maybe why the postpartum experience is altered in terms of the oxytocin level for a mother and for a father, or for a two-parent household or single-parent household, when you consider the fact that this mother is actually, it's very challenging for this mother to actually touch this baby because she's in surgery. So she has a curtain here that doesn't allow her to see that her abdomen is actually open, and they have to put everything back in place and stitch her back up. And so it's surgery. She has an epidural. She can't feel anything from her waist down. There was very little in terms of pushing and things along those lines, very little in terms of oxytocin release in those lines. It's a sterile environment where people are, it's a surgery environment. So infection can occur. So people, like this child, can't even see these people's faces, for example. It's just very different than the natural birth process, or even the epidural process, where vaginal birth is what I'm talking about versus a cesarean section. So you can see just from this image alone how this can affect those first few moments of life, and then therefore the first few weeks and potentially months for that child and that caregiver's connection and oxytocin and attachment style. It matters. This matters. Hopefully you can see that. So Erickson, I love this guy. He comes up with some really great ways of looking at the entire human development spectrum. And he looks at, okay, infancy, we're looking at basically this trust versus mistrust, which is kind of how we're talking about secure attachment style, anxious ambivalent, avoidant. It all makes sense. The baby just wants to trust. They just want to know that their needs are going to be met. And you can see all the way down the line which things start to become important at different phases. So for adolescence, it's your identity. Who are you? What are you going to do with your life? What defines you? And then in early adulthood, are you going to be married? Are you going to have a family? Are you going to be connected at work? Like, are you going to have these intimate relationships? Or because we're no longer in school anymore and we don't have all these peers just all around us, are you going to be on your own? Are you going to be isolated? And so we tend to focus on that in our 20s. And then eventually in our middle adulthood, that's when we really focus on, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing with my life? Am I connected in my life? Am I generating things? Am I making things better for myself and for my family and for the world? Or am I stagnant? And then lastly, what's my legacy? What am I left with at the end? Is there anything that I've done that will be around for generations after me to appreciate? And so this is just a great playbook for life. If you understand these phases of development, for psychosocial stages of development, and you can really understand where an individual is in any given moment in time. Okay. Now, parenting style obviously matters in all these things we're talking about. Understanding the child's temperament and understanding your own capabilities as a person, your own frustrations, your own patience, and things like that. The best parenting style, though, is flexible. It's not one size fits all. You can't parent one child the same that you can parent another child. They're different people. You're at a different stage of life. You have different economic resources or not. You have different life experiences. And so you need to maintain flexibility. And what you really can control are things like the neighborhood that child grows up in, the school that child attends, the extracurricular activities they are exposed to, and what kind of stimulations they have, video games, screen time, music, things along those lines. Otherwise, children are autonomous beings. They're going to figure things out for themselves. And it really just comes down to what was that environment that you created for that child, because that's really all you can control. So within that, we've got our parenting styles, right? So authoritarian parents are very strict, very punitive. Authoritative parents are very, they sort of understand the limits, but also understand how to talk to children, not like adults, but they tell their children why they're doing what they're doing. So there's not necessarily negotiation. Sometimes there is, but there's less sayings like in authoritarian households will be sayings oftentimes will be like, parents will say to children, because I said so. Why, Dad? Because I said so. You listen to me. If you live under my roof, you listen to me. That's an authoritarian perspective. An authoritative way of saying that is, why, Dad? Well, because if you do this, then this is going to be the cause and effect. And so it takes more time to be authoritative. It takes more patience because you have to explain things. Even as I'm an authoritative parent, it's challenging. Sometimes you just want to say to the kid, just listen, do what I said. But it doesn't create any long-term understanding of why that's the norm or the rhythm or the rule of the house. It takes time to explain to a 6-year-old, okay, multiple times, because remember, their memory works differently than yours, for them to truly understand why that rule is the way that it is. Now, in single-parent households and low socioeconomic households, authoritarian model parenting is oftentimes a good way to go, because you may not have time to be patient with your child because maybe it's a dangerous situation outside their house. Maybe you only get to interact with them in a few hours a day because you're working a couple jobs or whatever that is. And so just to get them through childhood, you have to be authoritarian. But as you get more and more means and more flexibility, it's more important to be authoritative so that your child understands why you're doing what you're doing with them, so that they just start to understand and develop those critical thinking faculties. Then neglectful parenting is just generally bad. I mean, you're just basically leaving your child on their own. Again, authoritative parents will start to allow their children to be autonomous and go out into the world and make mistakes and fall down, and they're there to swoop them up and pick them up and kiss them on the knee or whatever it is. But neglectful parents generally just don't engage with their children, and so that's a ripe recipe for avoidant and anxious ambivalent uh, attachment style. And then permissive parenting is very alluring because you're going to be friends with your child, best friends with your child. And maybe there's a place for that later in life when a child is in, late adolescent, early adulthood. You want to be friends with your child. But when children are young, you need to be a parent. You need to teach them how things work and that there are rules and that there are restrictions to their behavior. So permissive parents will let their children eat ice cream for breakfast. They'll bedtime is whenever the child feels like it. And usually that is a counter to parents being themselves children within an authoritarian household. So when you come from this strict authoritarian household, there's a swing of the pendulum to permissive parenting. And so we want to be cognizant that just basically hurts the child because they need their sleep, they need their nutrition, they need lack of screen time, all these types of things that we talk about as developmental psychologists. So permissive parenting is alluring because you want to be connected with your kids, you want them to like you. But at the end of the day, your job as a parent is to create a person or create a structure for a person to really blossom into who they're going to be. And a lot of times that takes guardrails. And so authoritative parents are thinking every day about how do I create guardrails for my child so that they'll have their best optimal growth while still feeling connected and secure. Now, marriage is obviously a big part of all this. Marriage is declining. It's less and less likely to happen nowadays for a variety of reasons. We can talk more about that in human development. If you're interested, you can take that with me at some point. But finding satisfying personal relationships remains a major challenge for adults. It's hard. People are busy. I met my wife online. I mean, it was something way back in the day that I experimented with and she experimented with, and it was Match.com, wasn't Tinder or whatever, but it worked, and I'm grateful for it. Arranged marriages tend to have real high satisfaction because in those societies where that's common, it's the opposite of the Western model where there's so many choices. The paradox of choice becomes an issue. Did I make the right decision? Is there somebody else out there that I should wait for? And people end up missing an opportunity with somebody who would have been a really great fit because it wasn't a perfect fit. Whereas arranged marriages, you have one choice, you make it work. Plus, you had all these people with these developed prefrontal cortexes that are in their 40s and 50s making this decision for you. So it tends to work really well. But in an individualistic society like the United States, it's not going to happen, right? We're always going to stay. I mean, we're probably going to stay in this model where we have a free choice, and that comes with its own challenges because now there's too many choices and you second guess yourself. But the highest satisfaction in marriage comes from partners who report economic resources because you just kind of take that stressor away. You share in decision making, so it's an egalitarian sort of model where it's not like necessarily like, one person is sort of the dominant one, another one is sort of the submissive one. It's kind of like, let's talk about this together and let's figure this out together. And lastly, they think that marriage is a lifelong commitment. They come from families where marriage is highly valued and it's not to be, taken lightly. So that's my family. My family is my sister is divorced. She was in a domestic violence situation, but before that, nobody had ever been divorced really in our family. And my parents weren't divorced. My wife's parents weren't divorced. So for us, marriage is a really sacred thing, and we've had plenty of challenges, but it's something that you just are committed to, and that increases marital satisfaction. Of course, divorce happens. Over half the marriages end divorce in our country. And of course, we want to think about the individual and the children. The children themselves generally do poorly in school. It could be because of the divorce, but it also could be because they were in a stressful situation to begin with. It could create other problems, right? Conduct issues, psychological disorders. It's stress, and it's lack of connection. And sometimes you don't have two parents in the household anymore to offer a full parenting spectrum to a child, and creates societal problems like poor social relations, fighting, things like that, because that, again, that's the behavior they've seen modeled, and low self-esteem. And unfortunately, they're much more likely to get divorced. So what do you do? Do you stay together for the kids if you're in an unhappy marriage? Well, we know that living in high conflict families is associated with even greater negative outcomes than parental divorce. So if you just stay together but you keep fighting all the time, that's even worse because of the higher cortisol levels, and impairs memory, and hinders emotional development and physical stress, which leads to lack of coping skills, and it's just challenging. So it really becomes super important that you, again, find that person on the very beginning that makes sense. Because if you have to get divorced later, that's hard for the kids. And if you have a tumultuous relationship, that's challenging for the kids. So it puts back to the Erickson stage of intimacy versus isolation, and identity versus confusion. You're a late teenager, you're in your 20s, you're trying to figure out where you're going in your life, where you're going to school, where you're going to major in, what you're going to get a career in, and somebody you're going to marry that you're going to hopefully be at 40 years old still happy with. It's a lot. It's a lot. And so the more mentors and guidance and people's opinions that you can respect, that you have in your lives, and you can modeling we talked about, the better. So trying to help you guys out with that. Lastly, as we look at aging in this country, by 2030, so 10 years from now, 1 in 5 people in North America will be over the age of 65. And so many children and adults will continue to work. I'm sorry, many older adults will continue to work because they have to, because Social Security is not going to provide the same level of life that it used to. So due to these financial concerns, life quality really becomes the question for these individuals. And I put here basically just the birth rates to help you understand that this giant wave of baby boomers, as you know, you got the greatest generation here. These are people that fought in World War II. Then the silent generation were the folks that sort of like missed World War II. Their older brothers and older sisters and aunts and uncles fought in World War II, but they didn't. And then the baby boomers come along, and this is a huge peak because of all the pent up, just like economic resources were really thin during the war, and literally people were not together as couples, and they couldn't have children if they didn't, even if they wanted to. And so this entire wave of babies is born through the 1950s and 1960s. Then they are all going through school when my generation is born. So my parents were born in 1949, the first part of the wave, and they had us in their 20s. So I was born in the 70s, but near this trough here. And so I'm one of the smallest generations in recent history. And so there just aren't that many people in their 40s right now, relative to people that are in their 70s, 60s and 70s, and relative to the people in their 20s, right, 20s and 30s, and people that are in their teens and early 20s now. So this is an interesting graph because you start to understand the sort of like aging wave that's coming our way. And when we look at big pandemics like flu pandemics and COVID-19 and those types of things, it's going to wipe out more people in this generation than it is in other generations. And so it's going to be much more of their cross to bear than for other generations. It'll still impact others, but it's going to be expensive, right? Senior living is expensive and home care is expensive. And so you can see what we're just big enough basically to accommodate this group. But it was a big group, and it's a big wave coming from Medicare to Social Security to, again, this hospital beds shortages and things like that. We're already starting to see when a big chunk of our populace is susceptible to infection and things like that, and death and dying. It impacts our psychology. It affects our experience. So I just put here that basically looking at this group, because it affects all of us, 45% of baby boomers have no savings at all. I want to make sure you guys really internalize that. No savings at all, so about half. About 55% of those have some savings, so it could be up to about $10,000. 15% have less than $100,000. I'm saying that, I'm sorry, that's actually more than. Oh, sorry, 50% have less than $100,000. So um, more than. Anyway, that's more than. In other words, only about 15% of people have $100,000 or more. Now, if it's going to take about $1 million to $3 million to sustain a life through this period of time, you can see what we're up against. So most will live off of Social Security benefits. And right now in 2020, the average Social Security benefit's about $1,500 a month. The problem with that, of course, is that the average cost of living in California is $4,200 a month. And the average cost of living in Nevada is 37, and the average cost of living in Texas is 4,000. So you can see that even if you had two people in a home together getting the average Social Security, they couldn't even live in Nevada or Texas, which are lower cost of living states than California. So this is a problem, and it's going to affect our society. It's going to affect how people age, how gracefully their experience sort of goes down for them. A lot of people are going to end up in board and care. A lot of people are going to end up in skilled nursing facilities that are paid for by the state, paid for by taxpayers, and usually those facilities are not of the highest order. And I've already lost a grandma that had to live in a skilled nursing facility that was a state-funded facility, and it was hard to watch. That's going to become more and more prevalent. And she was in the silent generation, not in the baby boom generation. So you can tell that obviously that was a less of an issue than it will be in the next 20 years. Something to think about because this is something we're inheriting. Remember, my generation is much smaller than yours, so the people that are in charge right now, right, the Gen Xers, right, we're few and far between. So we're going to be leaning heavily on the millennials and the Gen Z, iGen folks. Um, so that's what I got for you guys. So sorry to end it on a negative note, but as with anything negative, we can find beauty in it. These folks have a lot of wisdom to pass down to us, and a lot of information, and you guys are going to get more opportunities because we're going to need you. Okay, if you think about the fact that the baby boomers, when I entered the job market, they basically had the job market locked down, and it was really hard for me to get a high level position. But now there's few and far between of us, so we're going to be giving more and more opportunities to millennials and Gen Zs because we just don't have the numbers. So that's an opportunity. Hope you guys enjoyed the lecture. A lot of information. I have no idea how long I've been talking. I think it's been a while, but I'll see you for the next one.